Good morning and welcome. Thanks very much to everybody for turning up today. There's over 100 of us here, which is absolutely fantastic. And I apologise for the slight delay, having a few digital problems. However, we are here now. Our last AGM was held in Birmingham last October, and we have everybody here except for Ecology who have given their apologies. Can you please make sure that you have your name of your CLT as well as your own name in your box? And you can do this by opening the list of participants, finding your name, hovering over it, and then clicking on More, which will give you a rename option. I'm sorry that we need this for when we come to voting. And please note that we are recording the event as it is a Zoom webinar, and you will not be visible unless you are a speaker or asking a question. We're going to kick off with what will be a very lively discussion on the very relevant planning white paper, which has been the subject of some very hot debate in the House of Lords recently. And I'll now hand over to Catherine, who will introduce and chair this session.
Thank you, Cathy. Welcome everyone to the session in conversation on the planning white paper. Now, it's not every day that you get a government white paper making the headline news, but that's exactly what happened when the government published the planning white paper in August. In the planning white paper, the government proposes to radically overhaul the planning system, a system that's been in place since 1947, albeit with some quite major tinkering here and there since then. It's obviously of great significance to CLTs, as it could impact on the supply of land, but also the availability of funding for affordable housing. And we've now submitted our response to the consultation, which closed the other week, having had input from the enabler hubs across the country, as well as having had discussions with a number of national bodies. But even though the consultation has closed, we know that a lot of the detail will actually be worked out over the coming months, as in some cases, in some places, it was quite light on detail and quite high level. So I'm delighted that we're holding this session today at an important point in the process, and to be joined by two real experts on the topic. So joined by Jo Lavis, rural housing expert, planner by training, and vice chair of the National CLT Network, and Nicholas Boyd-Smith, founding director of Create Streets, member of the government's Task Force of Planning, and chair of the steering group set up to establish the government's new design body. Thank you both for joining us today, especially on such a gloriously sunny Saturday.
Thank you for asking.
I'm going to be putting a series of questions to Nicholas and Jo. And thank you to all of you members who sent in some questions for this. Sadly, we won't have a chance for you to ask questions of the speakers during the session, but if you do think of questions, please put them in the chat, add them in the chat as you go along, and then we'll make a note of them all and then reply to you as staff members next week. So without further ado, I have my first question, and that's to Nicholas. Nicholas, you were involved in the planning task force. What can you tell us about the government's vision for the planning white paper and what it means for CLTs?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for asking me, and hello, everyone. I mean, I guess I can, what can I say, what can I not say? I was one of the planning task force, alongside Christopher Cathy, QC, Miles Gibson, who's a very experienced planner and architect, Stuart Lipton, the developer, and an economist, Bridget Rosewell, and all of which names are public. And I should also say, because they never get the credit or the blame they deserve, some very expert civil servants, above all from the Ministry of Housing and planners within the planning team, and also from beyond around the civil service. So it was a process over the summer that led to the white paper. I mean, I can speak obviously confidently for what I thought, what I put in. It's not for me to speak for the government. I think that the key point to make possibly is, I mean, there is to try and understand where the government's coming from, which is always a useful thing to do if you're trying to respond to it, is over the last 150 years, particularly the last 70, 80 years, for the Conservative Party, the need for adequate housing and a supply of housing is an existential thing. And for anyone who's got any historical awareness of the development of the Conservative Party, that's even more so than just looking at the status quo. So if you think of, the success of Disraeli in the late 19th century with the Public Health Acts and the Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Act, and clearly the success of Macmillan as housing minister in the 1950s. Interestingly, I only discovered this the other day, actually. I was checking for something else. The target that Macmillan had in the 1950s was for 300,000 homes a year, which is a number that somehow seems reminiscent now. So the idea of providing enough homes so that there is a home-owning democracy is very, very hardwired into the Conservative Party. So that's, have that in mind. And clearly the ratio of homes to households in this country now has gone wrong. So if you look at an international comparison of ratio of homes to households, it's about 1 to 1 in this country, whereas the average in Europe is about 1.12, 1.13. So, given that there's always some necessary flux in housing, we don't have enough homes, and that gets even worse when you consider the regional misbalances in our economy. So broadly, we're overly dependent on the southeast. That's another issue of regional prosperity, which I don't suggest we go into now. Lots of the factors that are sometimes credited as the cause for that are baloney. So some people talk about credit rates as the lead. It's true that credit rates do push up asset prices, including houses and other properties, but it's not the driver for our problem. So we've got credit rates of basically zero, about 0.1. In Europe, for example, they're now negative. So that's not the reason for our undersupply of housing, and nor in an odd way. And I can be careful how I say this. Is the supply of affordable housing as a specific class? That's not to say we shouldn't be providing more, because we should, but it's not the primary driver of our housing shortages. We've got about an 18% affordable housing, submarket rents. European average is slightly depending on how you cut the numbers is about 12%. Nor is it actually planning, and this is where I think the government's now got to. So this is to fully answer your question. So there's the simplistic critique of planning, which I'm not, just for the record, I don't share. Is there aren't enough planning permissions, therefore that's the problem. And clearly there are lots of planning permissions, but they're not all coming through. But the real critique is that planning leads to a very constrained supply of providers of housing. And that takes out competition, and that means that we're very in hock to a small number of house builders who build out at the rates that suit them. And you can't really blame them for that, because they have to supply their pipeline. But we've got the most concentrated housing market in the Western world. Only about 10%, slightly depending how you count the numbers, between 10 and 20% of homes are produced by small, medium-sized enterprises or small local builders. That's down from about 80% 30, 40 years ago. And at each recession, at each economic shock, they come out and they find it very hard to get back into the market. We've got, as you will no doubt know, and as everyone on the call will know, we've got one of the smallest proportions of self-build, custom-build, community-led housing sectors in the Western world. In bits of America and Europe, it's up at sort of 40, 50%. For us, it's, again, slightly depending on how you do the numbers, it's about 10, 12, 13%. So we are very, very reliant on a small number of house builders. And the white paper, to its credit, wants to change that. And I think this then, I won't rehearse all the challenges that we have over affordability, but suffice to say, we've had pretty much the highest affordability challenge in the OECD over the last 40 years. So we've had a near 400% increase of house prices, as opposed to OECD average of a bit under 100%. So what the white paper at its heart is trying to do is bring the democracy forward. We do, in comparative terms, have a very strange planning system, and I understand why people are involved with it. And there are advantages to our planning system. So it's a very discretionary system. It puts a lot of emphasis on the development control process. There are advantages to that for complex and strange and idiosyncratic sites, of which there'll always be many. But there are disadvantages as well, because it means we're essentially running a Rolls-Royce system where we're not always providing Rolls-Royces. And the pressure on small sites, on standard sites, on sites which are actually quite similar to ones done before. The process is more similar. It's not identical, but is more similar than it needs to be. That's particularly an issue when there've been pressures, obviously, on local council budgets, as there have been over the last 10 years. Again, perhaps another discussion. So what the white paper is trying to do is, if you like, become a less strange system and do a systemic change, as interestingly Australia and New Zealand, and to a lesser degree Ireland, all of which were historically influenced by our planning system, have done, and try and move more of the democracy forward. Now, I use that phrase because it's a phrase I've pushed quite hard. I chaired the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission last year, which I think it'd be fair to say was one of the factors leading into the pillars of the white paper. And the idea of, right, how do we consult more strategically as to where housing goes, where new development goes, what it looks like, how it performs, what sustainability targets we have. Because what we find, and the social enterprise I run, Create Streets, works with many community and neighbourhood groups. I have to say 8 times out of 10, not always, 8 times out of 10, by the time it gets to a local group involved with an actual planning application, it's too late. So the current system is not working. It's not providing enough housing in the right place. It's certainly not providing sustainable housing. And I don't think it is adequately, it has its strengths, I don't think it is adequately allowing for local impact on the type of homes we produce where. So I think it's very hard to defend it in the absolute. So what the white paper is trying to do, and I won't rehearse all the pillars of the white paper, but just as worth finding out, so that the first one is creating three I won't say zones, because that isn't actually I think a correct way of putting it, but growth, renewal and protect areas, where there'll be permission in principle more easily for growth areas, renewal, easier to use things such as local development orders to create new homes, and protect will be far more like pretty much like the status quo in terms of permissioning. It's then putting more focus on digital planning and design quality, and putting that more into more visual and map-based local plans, which actually, just starting to read the responses to the white paper, has been, I think, broadly welcomed. Infrastructure delivery and moving to a standard betterment tax as opposed to a negotiable Section 106. And then finally, and I think probably most controversially, top-down targets. So those are the core sort of pillars of the white paper. I've probably been whittling on for too long, but so those are the key things, and I think that's what we need to respond to. Was that vaguely helpful?
Thank you. Well, I've got a follow-up question actually. So you've obviously been particularly involved in the proposals on design, as you just mentioned. What do you think CLTs need to be doing to get ready for some of those changes? And also, as part, just really briefly, as part of your answer, could you highlight any of the other opportunities you think there are for CLTs in the planning white paper?
Oh, crikey, that might be hard.
You have to keep it very brief.
Okay, fine. I apologize. So, look, I mean, I think it's actually quite hard to answer that question at this stage, because as critics of the white paper, I think reasonably say it's quite high level. I think you said it earlier. So there's lots to work out. The first thing I'd say is, keep doing what you're doing. Don't panic. This will be some years before this comes to pass. So, if you're working on sites and doing things now, don't stop anything you're doing. Would be sort of point one. Point two would be, I would speculate and imagine that in the protect areas, it'll be pretty much business as usual. And if you've got an idiosyncratic site, I think in all areas, it'll remain pretty much business as in the past, in the sense that the current system of planning permission is not being turned off. Where I think there is important opportunities, and I think Joe will be talking about this in more detail later, is within both the growth and renewal areas, there's discussion. Well, but actually that's important in two ways. First of all, by being more clear about what is and isn't acceptable. So, and I should talk about this before, by introducing the concept of more visual, more map-based local plans with some level of design codes baked into them. What you can build in a certain area should be clearer than it is now. And that's incredibly important, because what currently happens, both on design quality, height, massing, and also proportion of affordable housing and betterment tax, is that the big guys and the people who are prepared to cut corners on their assumptions of quality and affordable housing outbid the smaller guys and people who aren't prepared to cut those corners on land price. So it's often the guy with the toughest assumptions, it often is a guy, by the way, who gets to buy the land. And time after time, smaller developers, market entrants, local builders, self-builders, CLTs, there are fewer of them, fail to buy the land because they're not able to compete with more aggressive assumptions, or by people who can cross-subsidize because they're bigger developers. So the opportunity there is that more often, not always, because there'll always be idiosyncrasies, but more often it'll be clear what the land is permissible to do, particularly in growth and renewal areas, I think. So I think it is less, the potential is there, the less frequently CLTs, or indeed smaller builders, will be outcompeted for the land. So I think there is an opportunity in areas where at the moment it is hard for CLTs to develop. And then I think specifically there's an opportunity to ensure that there are sub areas that are allocated for self-build or for custom build or for community-led housing in one form or another. So I think there will be a need. It's not there yet. So again, you don't have to sort of panic yet, but in the months and years to come, as local councils start thinking about a new form local plan, assuming it comes to pass, how they divide up local authority areas, what sub areas are there, and what the design codes are all things that you should seek to get involved with. But you don't need to immediately. Again, is that a vaguely helpful answer?
Very helpful, thanks, Nicholas. Now over to Joe. What do you think are the top 3? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, lean forward, Catherine.
You don't want me to go too close. What do you think are the top 3 areas of concern then? And in particular, how could the proposals of zoning affect projects in national parks? And that's a question from Start CLT.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd just like to repeat, this is a very radical paper, and there's a lot of detail in there. So when I'm answering these questions, I'm just sort of focusing on some of the headlines, and there are obviously much more that we could say. I think the other thing is just really to echo what both you and Nicholas have said, and I was really encouraged, I have to say, at a round table that I attended. The Minister was very clear, this is the start of the process and there will be time to support the government as it develops its thinking. And speaking as Vice Chair of Ncltn, I know that's clearly what we would like to do. So it's in that sort of spirit of collaboration, although I'm not going to hold back entirely from some of the concerns that we have, but it's sort of raising those so that we know what the sort of things are that we want to be able to put to government in order to try and get this to work for community land trusts. So thinking about what were the 3 top concerns, I sort of thought, in fact, I was out with the dogs this morning and I thought, I know how to frame this. Let's think about what are the 3 words that we all sitting in front of this screen today share, and it's community, it's land, and it's trust. So for me, looking at the planning white paper, it was about how will communities be able to engage better with the process? Will it ensure that there is land available? That means that community land trusts can develop the housing that their communities need. And the other is, will it embed trust and confidence in the system, and that communities feel that their voices are heard? So on that basis, thinking about, well, okay, so what are the 3 concerns? And I'd like to start actually with the one about meaningful community engagement. And of course, we would support that. And I agree entirely with Nicholas's point that actually that engagement at the beginning of the process is absolutely critical. Leaving it until planning permission is often too late. And it certainly will be under this new system if that's what goes ahead. But I am concerned that actually some of the detail actually thwarts whether it would be possible to have that meaningful community engagement. And I think principally around that is actually proper community engagement takes time, and it takes skills in terms of facilitation, and it requires face-to-face conversations, both between the people who want to input into that plan, but also to make sure that people have the knowledge, information to be able to take part in that consultation from an informed perspective. And sometimes that means mediation. So how do you build up a consensus? And I don't think that the planning white paper has really taken on board just how much time and resource that takes. So only allowing 6 months, for example, for that first stage of the development of the plan is, I think, much too short. And then again, I recognise, although I'm not very good at it myself, but I recognise that new technology offers some exciting ways in which people can engage. But I'm also very conscious that for some people that is actually excluding. So if you're older, not very skilled in using IT, if you're visually impaired, if you live in a rural area where broadband is not there or slow, or mobile reception is poor, actually you're going to be excluded unless it's really clear that there are those range of different opportunities to engage. So that's the first one. And then the other, just linking into the one about community engagement up front, yes, but actually it also needs to be the thread which follows through in the planning process. And personally, I'm concerned that in growth areas and renewal areas, there's opportunities for communities and residents to engage at the point when an individual application comes through are going to be really quite restricted. And I think that for community land trusts, the reasons that's important, just to give an example, so the proposal that some development will come forward under the presumption in favour of sustainable development using something called planning in principle. But the detail, so it's about, yes, development should happen here, but things like how much affordable housing is a technical matter, and that's not going to be considered until later down the process, at which point the community is not engaged. And yet for a community land trust, knowing and being confident that there is that opportunity is a difficulty, I think. So that's the first, and that was quite long. The second, and I'll try and be a bit shorter now on the others. So zoning, I think it is too crude as it's currently drafted. And I was encouraged actually to hear Nicholas talk about, subzoning, because that doesn't come over very strongly in the planning white paper at all. And I think a real concern about doing it at this broad scale level, is it going to be sufficiently sensitive to the diversity of land uses? Planning is not just about housing, it's also about economic development, it's about open space, all the things which actually Nicholas has got inside his design guide, but actually don't seem to be really acknowledged in the planning white paper. So I think there's a concern, and particularly for protected areas. So the question about the national parks, and it won't just be the national parks, this is going to be all countryside, all communities that are not in the growth or renewal areas. And the planning white paper says, which is helpful, applications will be judged in the same way, same process as now for gaining planning permission. But there won't be policies in the local plan. They will be judged against the national planning policy framework and its states, which will set out the restrictions on development. And that immediately rings alarm bells. So where does that leave a community land trust who wants to provide homes in their community in a protected area? And I think that whole concern of communities and national parks, and actually shared by some national park authorities, is that without development, these communities and these areas will fail to thrive. So there has to be that opportunity for responding to local circumstances. And then quickly, neighbourhood plans, I mean, they are quintessentially community planning. And I think there is a concern that the planning white paper appears to diminish their role to one of being a local design guide. And of course, neighbourhood plans do and often will still continue to have design policies and set out codes, or however we like to put it, within the neighbourhood plan. But there's so much more than that. And part of that is about land allocations, part of it is about policies which set out the type of development, which means that community can achieve what it wants. And so many community land trusts have come out of neighbourhood development plans and have been supported by the policies that are in there, that I think if we lose that breadth of what a neighbourhood plan is, that would be unfortunate, to say the least. I know we're going to talk about infrastructure levy, so I won't talk about it now. So those are my principal concerns.
Thanks, Jo. Just picking up the sub-areas point that Nicholas raised, and you have as well, which, sorry, I have a little person running around outside. Hopefully you can hear
Joys
me.
of home broadcasting. Yeah, fortunately, my dog hasn't jumped in, but yeah.
Taking the idea of sub-areas for self-build and community-led housing, how could those work in practice then, in your view, Jo?
And again, I think that's a really welcome thing. It's really helpful that is there. And I did look this morning, and I have written it down, so I'm going to say it. So the principle behind that is to allow a range of housing aspirations to be met and help create diverse and flourishing communities. Well, yeah, let's face it, that is what community land trusts do. But community land trusts do that everywhere, not just in growth areas. So, I think the question is, would it not be possible actually to also extend that so that that opportunity is available both in renewal and in protected areas? And one of the things which has come up as you know, groups have come together and we've talked about response to the planning white paper, is this idea of community project sites or community priority sites. So we haven't obviously quite decided on the name, and I think that is a real opportunity to look at, would it be possible actually as part of that subzoning to have those sites embedded within, whether it's the local plan or whether it's the neighbourhood development plan or both. And I think, you know, as we talk about them, we think about, well, these are sites where the development is meeting an evidence need, and that would have to be shown. The benefit to the community would have to be secured in perpetuity, and it'd be clear that the mechanisms are there to do it. And, you know, back to the first point about meaningful community engagement, you know, the real evidence that that has been carried out and that there is that everybody in the communities had the opportunity to have an input into that development in terms of its design and what it's providing. And there's a really good example of this. So East Cambridgeshire supplementary planning document for community-led housing actually goes quite a long way in setting out sort of criteria and measures and how communities can meet those different tests. So I think if we could have that opportunity to have community priority sites, which include for providing for community land trust development in protected and renewal areas, I think that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Joan. Certainly, we put that in our response. I know a number of organisations, other organisations have also. Question to you now, Nicholas. One of the big concerns, as we've talked about, is the fact that the proposal to introduce a consolidated levy and replace the Section 106 with that, and what impact that could have on the supply of affordable housing. I know this is not your area of expertise.
Thank you.
But do you have any thoughts on that you can share with us?
Yes. May I just very quickly just say one thing in response to Joe, and actually not in the spirit of disagreeing, hopefully of being helpful. Just on the neighbourhood plans of the national parks, as I understand the intent of the government, and I may be misunderstanding it, I don't think there's any intent to diminish the role of neighbourhood plans. It's already the case that they can't remove the allocation of housing in the local plan, as you know, in a high document. I don't see any reason why the same principle couldn't apply. They can only increase the allocation, they can't take it out. So I don't think there's any need for neighbourhood plans to lose that key role alongside design codes. And just on national parks, again, as I understand it, I understand why you make the point. I don't think there's any intent for areas such as national parks, not to be able to provide new housing in the way they currently do. It's just not going to be sort of zoned for it in an en masse way, as indeed I don't think it should be. So I don't think you need to worry about that, but I think you're right to push at that. But to answer Catherine's question, and I apologise. Look, all studies of what make for good tax and fair tax and good regulation and fair regulation say, and we're sort of seeing this in the States at the moment, rules should be above the rule makers and should be above who you know. And how much you're taxed and how the regulation applies to you becomes something where relationships and the size of the pockets that you can use to employ the best QCs becomes a material factor. That's not a good place to end up. And I'm afraid, with the best will in the world, that's where we have ended up. So while I can understand why, particularly when the headlines hit in August about Section 106 to be scrapped and affordable housing, I can understand why people were concerned, because it is, as a statement of fact, it is Section 106 that currently provides lots of affordable housing. It is completely correct that there is something that there is a betterment tax, that developers or landowners making money from development are taxed at that point. And it's a complicated discussion which I'm not sufficiently expert to get into about when and how you apply that. I know a bit about it, but probably now's not the time. But I think we do need to move in a direction where it is clearer what the tax that is associated with development on land is. Again, actually, to make it easier for the small guys and the market innovators and the small businesses and the self-builders. Because at the moment, bluntly, if you're bigger with better lawyers, you often end up paying less than the smaller developers, and that cannot be right. So whereas I recognize there are lots of challenges and tensions and legitimate and understandable fears at what sounds like quite a scary headline and what certainly does have complex consequences, the idea that we certainly make a higher proportion in a higher number of cases where you've got a normal development or something that's close to normal, that you've just got an X% land tax that is associated with that when you as a landowner or developer make money, I think must be right. I think there's lots of complexity in how you get there, which I'm not going to speak to because I don't think I'm sufficiently expert to give good answers on that. But I think the principle, just as it should be with regulation, who you know does not matter, but that there is tax associated with it, I think is fair and right. So I think it doesn't need to reduce the supply of affordable homes. The devil is always in the detail. I hope it's a slightly high level answer, and I apologise for that, but I hope that's helpful.
Yes, Joe, can you share your thoughts on the consolidated levy, please?
I just caught the end of that. Okay. So again, the principle, absolutely, we should be capturing that uplift in value for the benefit of the community. But when I read this section, which I read many times to try and get my head around it, and I ended up almost at the point of thinking, this is where somebody has thought, let's throw all our ideas at the wall and just see what if anything sticks. I think, potentially this is going to be really problematic for community land trusts. And yes, it is about the detail. And I think that there are problems with the section 106 and the way that it is currently works, the process works. But I think this is in danger of, horrible say this, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it really does feel like that. So there is nothing in the proposals which will protect the affordable housing supply. So whereas at the moment, that because it will come through section 106, you'll still get the infrastructure, but you'll still get the affordable housing. Consolidating it means that there's always the opportunity and chance and likelihood, actually, that the one thing which you can flex is the affordable housing on a site. And therefore, it's quite possible that you lose that affordable housing. It talks about local authorities and registered providers, but primarily actually local authorities in terms of doing the delivery. But of course, we know that community-led housing groups also deliver. And I think that's just a sort of a detail, but it's one that we just need to be alive to and keep sort of nudging and saying, don't forget, it isn't just the big boys, because it isn't just big boys in the private sector, but it's also big boys in the affordable housing sector, which are squeezing out those smaller and more diverse providers. And I think there's a real concern about setting the rate at a national level and setting nationally the value below which infrastructure levy will not be taken. It means that it's not responsive to local market conditions or the size of sites. So I think particularly if we look at the low value one, the value threshold, for community land trusts, I think there is a big issue. It's likely that it will particularly affect small sites. They're going to dip in underneath that threshold. And we know that a lot of community land trusts, whether they're urban or whether they're rural, often use difficult small sites. So what are they going to do if they no longer are able to access those sites? Those sites no longer will be required to provide either infrastructure or affordable housing. And actually the same is true in low value areas. So there's excellent schemes we've seen which are about regeneration, redeveloping urban neighbourhoods in low value areas. Again, those sites are going to drop below the value, and therefore the opportunity to provide that affordable housing, really needed, good quality affordable housing, potentially will go. So I think there is that problem. I think the other is that the section 106 is more than just about affordable housing. It provides other benefits, community benefits as well, open space, community buildings, things which actually community land trusts are also often involved with. And significantly, it's the way in which you secure perpetuity, particularly outside of rural areas. So losing the section 106 is problematic, and it's not enough to put a condition in place. And section 106 is legally binding and it has that strength. So I think there's a lot more thinking that needs to happen, and particularly really understanding how economic viability works and how actually the developer knowing up front how much they're going to have to pay actually at the point that they're doing the negotiation for the land is absolutely critical, because it's that which then determines how much they offer for the land. And leaving it until much later means that actually they might have offered a much bigger price, higher price, than actually will deliver what's needed, but also at a price which means that it's not possible for SME and particularly community land trusts to compete in the land market. So I think this is one where there needs to be a lot more thinking, and hopefully there will be.
Thanks, Jo. Nicholas, I'm not going to ask you to come back on that because we're really running out of time. But I have one last question for you, Nicholas, which is that clearly the planning reform is clearly a priority for government and for Number 10. If we want to be positioning CLTs and community-led housing as much more central to that agenda, partly as a way of making the case for the renewed investment in the Community Housing Fund, what do you think our message should be?
Well, I'm delighted. I won't come back to Jo, I promise. That's something I do want to respond to. I'll keep myself in. I was delighted to hear, Catherine, that you're working with the Self-Build Group and with the Federation of Master Builders. I think that's absolutely right. And my advice would be, not in a cynical way, but in a sort of straightforward way, position yourselves as key to the growth of diversity of the provision of housing, pan sector and by size of provider. Because in doing so, you're speaking to every agenda, actually, to the centre right and the centre left, and it's also completely true, and it's exactly what you do, and it goes to the heart, certainly as I see it, and I think as the government sees it, of if you like, the problem, or one of the key problems of housing provision, which is we are too reliant on too small a number of very big providers, and I think you are a crucial part of the response to that, both sort of economically, but also actually sociologically. And I think if you position yourself well, you're also speaking, just to touch on another agenda, to the government's agenda about the revitalisation of towns and the levelling up agenda. And if you look at some of the data on how some towns are performing and regional growth, I mean, it all gets pretty horrific pretty quickly. You are part of the answer to that, and I think you can make good alliance with a range of organisations and talk to the heart of what the government's trying to do. So I think there will be detailed work, as Jo was starting to touch on, as I was earlier, in how the white paper pans out. But that fundamental point of trying to reduce some of the uncertainty in planning so that more small market entrants, innovators, people doing modular, groups such as your own, are able to compete in the land market. I have responded to Jo's point right now, which is absolutely crucial, because so many of the requests, for money or for funding or for infrastructure, are actually a function that you can't get at the land. And the reason you can't get at the land is because it's too expensive, because there's an undersupply, but also because other people are able to make tougher assumptions about what they'll do with the land because they've got economies of scale, or they're prepared to take out other stuff. So if what is required of the land is more bedded into the land price, it will be easier for smaller people to play. So I think that would be my core point for you and the central team to respond to. It's obviously a slightly different answer to CLTs up and down the country. There you go, keeping it brief.
And thank you so much to both of you for bringing such expert insights on this. I feel like there was a lot to cover, and there is with the white paper, and I feel like we only scratched the surface on some things, but where we did, it was incredibly helpful. And obviously a lot still needs to be worked out, so we'll be using everything you shared with us in the way we work with government over the coming months. I know people did put some questions in the Q&A, and thanks so much for doing that. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're not able to actually put those questions to the panelists because we wanted to make sure we covered the kind of key topics. But as I said, though, we will be responding to you as an organisation next week. We'll respond to you via email. Hope that's okay. And thank you again to our fantastic panelists, Jo and Nicholas.
That means you, Jo. Doesn't mean me.
Thank you to both of you.
Can I shamelessly say, it's an absolute pleasure. Sorry,
for bringing your expertise. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Can I shamelessly say, I've put a link to a little video that Create Streets does on what makes good for good places, which I hope is helpful. So that's my shameless plug for our I've put that in the chat function. So if you're having trouble sleeping, Nicholas, that will help.
I'll now hand back to Cathy for the rest of the AGM.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. I found that extremely stimulating, and it's not my role to comment on what went on, but I found it difficult to keep quiet. However, I think that was extremely useful. My job is to deal with the main business of the AGM, which is fairly straightforward. You can put questions through the chat function, and I see that many of you have done that already, and I've watched the chat function during that debate, really very interesting. At the end of this session, you'll be asked whether you approve the report and accounts, and Jonathan and Sophie will be monitoring the chat and be able to tell us the result at the end of this session, but more of that at the end. This is our 10-year anniversary, which is a great milestone for us. And together we have established the CLT movement in the minds of the public, the government and industry. And we're rightly immensely proud of our achievements. During those 10 years, we have now 347 active CLTs, up from 20 a decade ago, and that's a huge step forward. We have built 1,062 homes, and that's up from 79 a decade ago. And there are almost 7,000 homes, CLT homes, in the pipeline. You can have a look at our YouTube channel for a 2-minute video of our work over the past decade and our State of the Sector report for more detail on what we have achieved together. You've all received the annual report, and that has described what we've done in the last year. During the last year, we have closed and evaluated the CLT Startup Fund, which ran for a decade and supported over 200 CLTs and awarded £700,000, which led to 367 homes being built, with a further 3,000 in the pipeline. Now, in the current economic climate and with COVID, I think that is some real achievement for us to be proud of. We ran the Community-Led Homes Programme, which invested £6 million. The Community Housing Fund has stimulated over 23,000 community-led homes, and we've supported 26 enabler hubs with 182 advisors and associates now providing high-quality advice to you, the CLTs. And our website has received over 50,000 visitors. So, you know, we've not been idle. Through our lobbying, we have secured exemptions for CLTs from the ban on leasehold and the right to shared ownership, both of which would have undermined the ability of CLTs to keep homes affordable. And keeping homes affordable is a major battle, as we can see through the debate we've just had. Not everybody understands the process of affordability. I'm going to turn to the statement of financial activities, and if you happen to have that open in front of you, that might be helpful, but it's not essential. The overall picture at the end of 2019-20 was positive, with unrestricted funds of over £500,000. £80,000 has been reserved to invest in projects next year, including a new website. The net surplus for the year was over £304,000, and we have carried significant reserves into the current financial year as set out in the accounts. We have set a budget for 2021, which is unfortunately forecasting a deficit of £150,000. Trustees are fully aware of this and have discussed strategies for dealing with this. The good news is that we will finish the year with sufficient reserves. Staff have been working very hard to fundraise to avoid an unsustainable deficit in future years. The Cohesive Communities Fund, which began in 2019-20, will close next year in 2021. And this fund distributes funds to 16 CLTs and has a balance for its second year of over £89,000. You can find all the details on page 11 of the annual report. And we're now going to move to a Q&A session with Tom.
Thank you, Cathy. So if anybody has any questions for us about our annual report, if you could pop it in the chat box and we'll answer. And those of you who can't find the email with the annual report, I think Jonathan's put a link into the chat box as well for the Eventbrite. If you don't have any questions, we could.
Can I say on the chat, I can see that somebody is asking where they find the YouTube channel. So can you tell them that, John? Because I'm afraid I personally don't know. Oh, I can see it's underneath. There is a link underneath. Sorry, I need to read down before I start speaking.
You can watch the video where Beth, Catherine and I tried to do a video during lockdown in a park. Kids kept running past. Okay, well, Cathy, I don't think anyone's got any questions. We don't often get questions for our report, but if people did have them and they think of them later, then again, maybe put them in the chat and we'll pick it up next week.
Okay. Right, so the formal business of the AGM is that we now move to the adoption of the accounts, and for the second time our accounts have been audited, and we need to ask you, the members, to approve the adoption of the accounts. I'm pleased to say that we won't need to audit our accounts in the next financial year, which is good because the cost of auditing is quite considerable. So can you use the function, the chat function, sorry, to say whether you approve the accounts, and if you don't approve the accounts and the annual report, can you type in not approve, and then Sophie and Jonathan will be monitoring that, and we will, after Catherine and Tom have outlined the next 12 months, we will give you the result from that. So over to Tom and Catherine while people vote on whether they approve or don't approve the report and accounts.
Thanks, Cathy. So this is an update on the next 12 months. Well, the team have been working really hard since April to deliver our business plan. They've been getting on a lot of work. We don't have time to cover it all. We just wanted to share a few highlights with you, Tom and I did. So on advocacy, we've continued to lobby really hard to get the Community Housing Fund renewed after its closure in March this year, focusing firstly on the spring budget earlier in the year, and then more recently on the comprehensive spending review, which was in September. Now, a decision on the comprehensive spending review was expected in the autumn budget, but as we all know, that was then cancelled. However, we have been told that Treasury is still making decisions on budgets for departments, and they will be made on or around the 24th of November. So that's the key date for us. As part of that campaign, we commissioned Capital Economics, renowned economists, to do a study on the value for money of community-led housing, to be able to prove to Treasury that actually it's worth investing in. So that was a barrier we were often coming across with Treasury. Thank you to everyone who completed the survey. We had over 100, actually I think we had 119 responses, which was excellent. And because of that, we were able to demonstrate that with every pound invested in community-led housing, there is another £2.70 returned in terms of the positive impact on society. And we've been using that evidence as part of our campaign. We've also been able to get the support of a number of national organisations to back our ask on the CHF. So we've had a number of think tanks as well as housing bodies also themselves lobby for a continuation of the CHF, including the Chartered Institute of Housing, for example, which has been excellent. And finally, because of all your brilliant letter writing, we now have almost 80 MPs who've been contacted by you about the Community Housing Fund, and a number of them have gone on to write to the Chancellor, urging him to renew it on or around the 24th of November. So as a result of all that, we're really gaining political traction. So in addition to having secured a commitment in the Conservative manifesto to support community-led housing, we had the Housing Minister at an event of ours a few weeks ago say he wants to see CLTs and community-led housing play a much bigger role in the government's Building Back Better programmes. We also had Danny Kruger, MP, who was asked by the Prime Minister to do a review into the voluntary response to COVID, recommend in his report that CLTs and community-led housing should be the future of social housing. So not fringe and niche, the future of social housing. So a lot of really positive words, warm words. What we now need, though, is to turn that into actual investment. So we need money for the CHF. The next 3 weeks are really critical for that. So as I said, between now and the 24th of November. So if you haven't yet written to your MP, this is a little plea to say, please do. We have templates and we'll send a link in our newsletter next week. We've made it hopefully easy to do that. If you have written to your MP, but you don't know whether your MP has contacted the Chancellor yet, perhaps you might be willing to give a little gentle nudge to see whether he or she has been able to do that. That'd be great. It's a really difficult time to be making the case for putting money into the Community Housing Fund when obviously there are, there's a lot of money needed to support the country with COVID, but we know how important the Community Housing Fund is to you. We want to see those homes built, so we're doing everything we can. Thank you so much for your help with that. I'll now hand over to Tom with some of the other updates.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello from Shropshire, where I am today. I came to visit my parents-in-law with my wife and baby, and we got snapped by lockdown, so I'm in Shropshire for a month. So we're ending in either last year or this year, quite a lot of projects are coming to an end, but often on a high. So some of you might be aware of a project called Chic, which is part funded by the EU and aims to grow the CLT movement across Northwest Europe. That's ending in December, having supported 33 new CLTs across the region. And with a nice bit of news at the end of it, because we won a prestigious award from the European Commission the other week for the project. Funding is also coming to an end connected to the Community Housing Fund for the Community-Led Homes programme, which we've run jointly with UK Co-Housing, the Confederation of Cooperative Housing and Locality. That's been supporting the enabler hubs, the advisors, giving small grants, and so on. And we want that to be able to continue if the Community Housing Fund is able to be extended. And we're also looking at developing other business models to put work like the advisor training scheme in the enabler hub network on a sustainable footing. They're critical already, and if you've read our business plan, which we sent out earlier in the year, very central to the approach we want to take. One focus for the next year for us will be developing the market for CLTs, which is encouraging more housing associations and private developers and landowners to partner with projects. We'll shortly be releasing a new report or piece of guidance on how housing association CLT partnerships can work, for example, which is endorsed by all the major housing association sector organizations. So housing associations can have confidence that it's a good option. We'll be doing more work to get more lending into the sector, particularly for mortgages for your residents, and encouraging public land to be transferred into CLTs, which comes back to the planning white paper, which talks about this as well. So we'll be sharing updated plans for you for the year ahead in the new year. We always welcome your thoughts on what you'd like us to be doing as well. And hopefully see you in sort of future sociable meetings that we'll be having. So that's a quick overview of our plans. I'm just going to pass back to Cathy now. Cathy, who's muted. We haven't had you're muted yet in this meeting.
Sorry, apologies. Just to comment on what Catherine said, as far as the information I've received is that the CSR will be debated on the 25th of November, so we need to keep a close eye on that. At most of the AGMs of most organisations, there is often a change of trustees or directors, and ours is no exception. This year, however, some extremely long-serving trustees are retiring and we lose their valuable expertise. Pam Johns, Ian Crawley and Joe Lavis have served 6 years and according to our constitution have to retire. They have all made valuable contributions to board meetings and supported the organisation tirelessly throughout. I'd like to pay a special tribute to Joe Lavis, who has been the vice chair and really gone the extra mile to fulfil that role. I'm personally indebted to her for her advice, support and friendship throughout my time as the chair. We are moving into a period of transition in the organisation, with some new trustees being recruited, and Joe has agreed to be co-opted back onto the board for a short period in order to help us with that transition. Nevertheless, we will miss the expertise of all 3 trustees and wish them well. They have received a small gift from the organisation to mark their retirement, but I fear it's not quite the same as being able to thank them in person, physically at the AGM. I'd also like to pay tribute to our newer trustees, Vanessa White, Helen Lawrence and Steve Hoey, who have really risen to the challenge and made a valuable contribution to the running of the organisation. The newly recruited trustees, when appointed, will be co-opted over the next month or 2 and go forward to the next AGM for election. I would like at this stage to pay tribute to the staff, Catherine, Tom, Rachel, and Sam. Sorry, Rachel is currently on maternity leave. Sorry. And Beth, Rosie, Polly and Sophie are with us today. Anne, unfortunately, is not able to be with us today. The staff are a closely knit team who have, like others, had to deal with a very different working situation over the last year. They have all risen to the challenge, kept in touch with each other, and supported those who have struggled temporarily and come through much stronger. We are lucky to have some dedicated staff to support the organisation, and I'm sorry if because of my phone ringing I have missed naming a member of staff. I apologise for that. Lastly, we say goodbye to Jonathan, who has been covering Rachel's maternity leave. He now has a full-time job and leaves us at the end of December. He and Sophie have done a marvellous job in organising today's event, and we wish him well in his new venture. At this stage, I would have handed over to Stephen Hill, who would have given us a tribute to Catherine Hand, who was instrumental in setting up the Community Land Trust organisation. But he has sent his apologies because he has had some technical issues with his laptop. But he has suggested that we might pop something in the newsletter, and I'm sure that we will be able to do that. I would now like to hand over to Tom, who will wrap up this session of the AGM. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Cathy. It's a shame Stephen isn't able to join us because we've also had some fantastic news about him just today, that we nominated him for the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors Lifetime Achievement Award, and he's been awarded this year. It's a very prestigious award. He was another one of those people who's been instrumental in the CLT movement for 20 years or so. And long before I joined the CLT network, I knew Stephen working in the GLA in London. And he's just been absolutely instrumental in setting up London CLT and the Community Land Trust movement and so on. So it's a real honour for him, and we're really delighted. And again, we'll be putting something in the newsletter, so he'll pick it up there if not here. So thank you everybody for your contributions, the chat, thank you to Cathy and Catherine and Joe for chairing and for the conversation before the AGM. I thought it was really interesting. Normally we'd all be together in a room, and for me the saddest thing about this year has not been being able to meet and visit CLTs and meet people involved with CLTs in person, and we'd all be going off and having a chat over a sandwich at this point. But hopefully if you do go off and have a sandwich, you may be coming back to one of our clinics. If you've booked, you will have been sent a Zoom link. They start, the first clinics start at 12:30 and they run until around about 2 o'clock. So please be prompt in arriving at your clinic. They're only 15 minutes long, just a brief opportunity to have a conversation with some experts on a particular topic. And after yours finishes, there's only a short break before the next one. So please do get there promptly to make the most of it. If you have any problems getting into the clinic, it's maybe worth trying to join just a few minutes before it starts, then please email Jonathan on jonathan@communitylandtrusts.org.uk. Otherwise, hopefully see you in one of those, and if not, then somewhere else soon. Thank you all for your attendance. That's it.
Thank you.